Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the Keiser Report. You know, in the old days, back when bankers had the decency to jump, shady businesses used to have to fly by night. Today, shady businesses fly by day. No con is too brazen, no theft too audacious for today's Ponzi and fraud economy. The private and central banksters operate in broad daylight. Stacy.
Max, it's all out there for you to see. It's not very difficult to see what's going to happen. This fiscal cliff is actually an economic and central bankster banking cliff that we're approaching. The first headline, Max, database confirms Max Keiser guest statement. So this is regarding Dominic Frisby when he told you the story of having dinner with a head of gold at HSBC, through which most gold in the world is transferred at some point or other. And this head of gold at HSBC told him that despite the fact that China is the biggest producer, he never sees bars with the Chinese stamps on them. So the Bullion Bars database search found that in the database, I found 0 matches for Chinese manufactured gold bars in the GLD records, and also extended the query to see if other vaults had any. I was mildly surprised to find none. Surprising because our current gold sample size includes data from not just HSBC London Vault, but also Royal Canadian Mint and Viamat, London, Hong Kong, and Zurich. That's
right. China is not putting any of their gold into the marketplace. They're keeping it all for themselves. And you mentioned fiscal cliff. The fiscal cliff, of course, is the culmination of years and years of failing to take responsibility for a rogue economy that they're going to try to reconcile all at once when the entire population of America jumps off the fiscal cliff. Whether they do so in the next 2 months or 6 months or 12 months is irrelevant. That fiscal cliff is coming. The gold cliff is also coming, and it's something that I think people need to be aware of.
That's right. Well, actually, that takes us to this next headline, Max. Gold reserves stored securely. So after decades of trying, the Bundesbank actually has responded to all the queries from Gatta, from Larschall, from Max Keiser. They actually give a list of where their gold is stored. And they say that Deutsche Bundesbank Frankfurt has 1,036 tons, or 31% of Germany's gold. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York has 1,536 tons, or 45% of all of Germany's gold. Bank of England has 450 tons, or 13%, and Banque de France has 374 tons, or 11%.
Well, that's not going to return to Germany, because as you head to the cliff, whether it's the fiscal cliff or the bond cliff, the gold held in America on behalf of Germany will not be returned. But Germany knows this. And that's why Germany is ransacking the economies of Europe right now, because they have their eye on the gold in Greece, for example. Greece had to pledge 111 tons of gold to Germany when they signed off on the memorandum to become beholden to the Troika when they lost their sovereignty. Italy has 2,400 tons of gold. I predict that Italy will have to put that gold into the coffers of Germany. So Germany is playing a game here where they're bankrupting Europe by cutting off the credit spigot. In return, these countries will have to forfeit their gold, and this is the way the gold wars are going to unfold.
And in your opening, you mentioned private banksters and central banksters, central banking banksters. And the private banks get away with their crimes. The word they use to cover up all their crimes, as you've mentioned, is market making. The central banksters, as you see here, they always use the word liquidity. That's what their crimes are. It's just liquidity operations. And this is what the Bundesbank says here as well, is why they have all their gold overseas is basically for liquidity operations.
Yes, this is one of the canards used by banksters, whether it's market making or liquidity. It's terms that are used to cover some basic underlying crimes. And of course, the one country in the world with the absolute worst position with the coming gold wars is Britain, who gave away half of its gold. It's got roughly 300 tons of gold. It's one of the lowest gold positions in the world. And Britain at some point will have to go into the open market and start buying gold bullion. And I think that will shock a lot of people.
I think that's perhaps why the Bundesbank does admit that from about 2000, they did repatriate 930 tons of gold that was held here in London. So perhaps they saw what Gordon Brown was doing and they were alarmed and thinking, well, surely when a crisis hits, he's going to go looking for somebody's gold.
Right. When Gordon Brown, during the creation of the euro, euro, sold half of Britain's gold supply, 300 tons, at $250 an ounce, the worst price for decades. Germany started to think about this coming gold war. They repatriated a lot of their gold. However, many tons of their gold, more than 2,000 tons of their gold, is still held outside of the country, is still in foreign hands. It's not safe in those hands, and I think knowing this from 2000, they've known that they've had to set up a situation where they go and raid the gold of Italy is really the prime contender, 2,400 tons. I believe Germany will make a move on Italy's gold, mark my words, in the next 12 to 18 months.
Well, the Bundesbank goes on the website and they say they're going to audit this gold. They're actually going to go and audit, and they're going to repatriate 150 tons over the next 3 years. But then they go on to say, but please, for years, our gold has been stored by the highly esteemed central banks of the United States, Great Britain, and France without provoking any complaints whatsoever, not by just any fly-by-night operators. Part of the debate in Germany has veered somewhat towards the absurd.
Their actions belie their words. This is the rhetoric that they put out there, but their actions are they're madly attempting to scramble to repatriate their gold because they know that the U.S. has become a rogue banking state of kleptocrats that are printing money. The U.S. has printed $25 trillion in government paper. The global central banks have printed hundreds of percentage of their GDP number in more sovereign bonds. The total indebtedness around the world is in the hundreds of trillions of dollars of sovereign bonds. During the past few years, what's the total supply of gold in the world? How has that increased? 8% maybe at best? So they realize that when the fiscal cliff, when the global bond cliff occurs, when Wile E. Coyote finds himself looking down into the canyon and the Roadrunner has only beep, beep to say, they're going to look for their parachutes of gold, which unfortunately, in many of the cases, do not exist.
The fly-by-night operations, as you said in the opening, it's now fly-by-day. They openly do it. Ben Bernanke flies his helicopter in broad daylight. That's what quantitative easing is. It's a fly-by-day operation. They're letting everybody know that they're engaged in a brazen con. But on the other hand, fly-by-night is also, indicative of a shaky operation that might just fall apart at any moment. And that's subtly, underneath it all is what is really happening is these fiat currencies, the US dollar, the Eurozone, these are fly-by-night operations. They could fall apart any night. They could just disappear overnight. You wake up in the morning, you say, hey, I'm owed $10,000.
Bernanke's actions are to defer to another day the tragedy of having a worthless fiat currency. Again, the cliff metaphor, whether it's a fiscal cliff or a gold cliff. The people in Athens who are protesting, who are taking an action against the government, their only concern in Greece, hello Greece, your only concern should be to hold on to your gold. Because that's the only thing left when the global economy implodes. You've got 111 tons. The Troika says that they now own your gold. You can't let them steal your gold. The same thing in Italy. The Occupy Wall Street people they should go down to the Federal Bank of New York, the Reserve Bank that's in New York, the chapter in New York, and demand their gold. That's the only thing that matters heading into this paper apocalypse.
Well, just as important as gold, which is important to a nation, and the sovereignty of a nation is for the individual, as we've said for years here, is silver. And that's the Silver Liberation Army. It seems to be picking up steam in Asia. All you Occupy Wall Street people, you failed to join and join the revolution. But in China, silver demand in China for wealth protection to climb to record 7,700 tons. So Bloomberg has reported that silver demand in China is expected to be up 10% next year. That's after being up 15% this year. And they did note that a lot of it is due to quantitative easing. So here these Chinese people see the quantitative easing going on in the US and across Europe. And after the US Fed's QE1, from December 2008 to March 2010, silver rocketed 53%, almost twice the jump as gold. And for QE2, ending June 2011, silver rose 24%. And Morgan Stanley predicts that silver will again return more than gold after QE3 was announced this September.
Well, here's a handy guide for Chinese people, or anyone for that matter, but the Chinese people. they have a saying in China that you should own your weight in gold, or in this case, silver. So if you weigh 180 pounds, you should own 180 pounds of silver. So that should be your guide going forward. Anyone who doesn't have their weight in silver will find themselves in the casino gulag, eating Monsanto-created genetically modified slop and having to watch cable TV news all day long.
Well, Yang Guo Hui must be a very big man, because here's a guy who is the president of Hunan Yishui Rare and Precious Metals Recycling, and he says, I'm bullish on silver, so I personally have stockpiled 3 tons of it at home.
That's a good role model. You should own several hundred pounds of silver at the bare minimum. We're the paper apocalypse, and we've got the 4 horsemen of the paper apocalypse right here, the biggest 4 banks in the UK that are aiding and abetting this entire tsunami of fraud, which has yet to hit. If you thought the 2008 crisis was bad, that was just a warm-up act.
Here I showed you that the Chinese are piling into silver. Over in the US, 33 times, you poor dumb bastards. This is from the Reformed broker, Max. And he says, since December 2007, investors have poured more than $1.1 trillion into bond mutual funds and exchange-traded funds, more than 33 times the amount allocated to equity funds and ETFs. Many institutions have also reduced long equity allocations.
Look, the people in America, the dumb country, they say that gold is in a bubble. Okay, let's talk about the U.S. government bond, 10-year bond. Never in 238 years has the price been higher. The U.S. government bond is in a 238-year high. That is a bubble. And all of these idiots out there, they're buying, stockpiling, all kinds of provisions against the big storm. The big storm coming, let's buy an extra loaf of bread. Meanwhile, their entire net worth being eviscerated by the paper pushers, and how much gold and silver do they own? 0. Nada. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo.
Well, investors famously always do pile in on that third leg of any bull market when it turns into a bubble. And now, Josh Brown, downtown Josh Brown, he says there's going to be such a brutal bond investor slaughter at some point over the next decade that the streets of Boston's mutual fund district will run red with blood. The skies will be shot through with the lightning and thunder of unexpected capital losses, and those who manage to survive will envy the dead.
Well, Josh Brown, what a wordsmith. Of course, in this case, he's absolutely correct. Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for that scintillating report here on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Don't go away. Stay tuned for the second half. I'll be talking to John Butler. Hi, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to turn to John Butler, CIO of Amphora Capital and author of The Golden Revolution. John, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, John Butler, let's talk about the Bundesbank. Most assume that the legendary central bank has been sidelined to a more powerful European central bank. Is this true?
Well, it is up to a point, and I think it's important to understand that the Bundesbank remains to this day a very unique central bank. It's the most independent in the way it was set up and designed. And the powers that it supposedly gave to the ECB, and well, certainly did in a formal legal way, the powers it gave to the ECB to get EMU rolling do not in fact circumscribe its other powers, and arguably the single most important one of those is simply the role that the Bundesbank plays in German culture. And this should not be downplayed. When the Bundesbank objects to something, in this case, for example, what the ECB is recommending with respect to bailouts, that resonates in Germany in a way that a similar statement by a central bank in other countries, such as the US or the UK, simply would not resonate. The Bundesbank is almost revered. I don't think that's too strong a word.
The word on the street is that the Bundesbank is taking exception with the ECB because the ECB is now in bed with the IMF, the World Bank, and these other global institutions. And what the Bundesbank fears, and what the people of Germany fear, is that Germany will lose its sovereignty, just like Greece has lost its sovereignty. Italy is on track to lose its sovereignty. Ireland has lost its sovereignty. Portugal has lost its sovereignty. So the people of Germany are afraid that the ECB is really in bed with these global institutions, which, of course, the IMF is part of the Federal Reserve Bank. It's the American bank. So they fear ceding sovereignty to these foreign governments, and there seems to be a lot of tension along those lines. Given the trends that we see, isn't that fear justified?
I think it is justified. And in fact, when you see the Bundesbank's position portrayed in the media, they talk about it pejoratively as if, oh, they're isolated, oh, nobody agrees with them. But that illustrates the point. All these institutions you just mentioned, they're all pushing the same, for lack of a better word, globalist agenda, taking sovereignty not just away from potentially the weaker euro area sovereign countries who do need help, you could say, but also the strongest of all, including Germany. And how do the Germans feel about that? Well, they have a natural suspicion of it to begin with, and now their own, as I used the word a moment ago, revered, as it were, Bundesbank is warning them that this process has already gone too far, that there are certain powers that they should not give to the ECB, that they should not give to Brussels, the powers of the bailouts.
You use the word globalist, and this is a word that is popping up more and more, where 5 years ago you would hear the word globalist or New World Order, over there in America on Alex Jones' show, my friend Alex Jones. And the people at that time would say, oh, Alex, you're a conspiracy theorist. But yet now governments around the world are expressing a fear of this emerging global governance. And with the case of the IMF, the World Bank, the ECB, is there any, what are your thoughts on this, John Butler? The idea that the sovereign bond market is unsustainable. They are adding more into the market. They're continuing to roll up these bonds, issue more bonds. Supply bonds is increasing. Maturities are being extended. Traditionally, in the past, the central banks have been the last resort, lender of last resort. They're totally overburdened with toxic securities now. Is there any validity to the idea that the IMF, maybe with the ECB and others, will create kind of a global lending facility to supersede all of these central bank lending facilities to try to roll up all this bad debt once again, maybe back it with a new global currency like a special drawing right? I know that's a lot to take in, but it is the scuttlebutt at confabs like Davos and others. This is what they talk about. Have you heard of this? What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this goes back to the 1960s. The SDR as a someday theoretical dollar replacement reserve currency. That's been openly debated in elite policy circles since the 1960s. And in fact, when France withdrew from the London gold pool and expressed its displeasure at the entire Bretton Woods arrangements, de Gaulle made his statements with his advisor, Jacques Rueff, sitting behind him, and Jacques Rueff was making the point back then that the dollar reserve standard was not in France's interest, but also a theoretical globalist SDR standard would not be in France's national interest. And you're starting to see a similar collision of national interests today and this internationalist agenda, which, yes, in theory could create a new currency, which could be printed at will by some collection of governments, and which would be presented, of course, to the world as some wonderful solution to all these problems we have. Well, I would argue, and in fact I do argue in my book, it would make these problems even worse.
Okay, so let's focus on Germany here. So let's say that people of Germany, they finally figure out that their sovereignty is being flushed down the toilet, and they make a movement toward leaving the euro. So this is one scenario that is the least talked about scenario. People talk about Greece leaving the euro. But they never talk about maybe Germany leaving the euro. They stay in the euro because of these problem periphery countries. The euro is relatively cheap. Of course, Germany is an exporting powerhouse. They benefit from that. But if the burden, if the loss of sovereignty becomes a stark reality, then they would be potentially thinking about leaving the euro. How would that scenario play out?
Again, if you look at history, the fact is Germany as a country has been willing on multiple occasions to allow its currency to become very, very strong relative to its trading partners. It might have caused a recession, it might have caused some economic hardship, but Germany survived and in fact would innovate and produce its way from strength to strength, export again, find some export channel, and would continue to grow. Germany has a demonstrated track record of surviving with a strong currency. Now, the Germans are not only aware that they've had a strong currency through the decades, they're aware they've outperformed as an economy despite this strong currency, or perhaps because of this strong currency. Again, the Germans revere the Bundesbank. Many of them are still long for the days of the Deutsche Mark, which was so widely regarded around the world, and didn't have any of these uncertainties, institutional, European, Eurocrat uncertainties associated with the euro currency. Many of them never wanted the euro in the first place. And now the Bundesbank itself is sounding the alarm that perhaps this road to bailouts, they're down so far already that they're doing potentially serious damage to the credibility of the German institutions that are being sacrificed, as it were, for the European project.
Somebody in Germany is starting to wake up to this because they're starting to repatriate their gold. They're nervous about their gold. It's held overseas. Apparently, during when Gordon Brown sold half of Britain's gold, Germany repatriated a large amount of tonnage from the UK, thinking that the world had gone mad. And so on their website, the Bundesbank, however, explains that the reason they hold 41% of their gold reserves in New York, quote, the gold held with New York Fed can, in a crisis, be pledged with the Federal Reserve Bank as collateral against U.S. dollar-denominated liquidity. Now, this contradicts Ben Bernanke's statement to Congress in which he claimed it was nothing more than a tradition or a trinket to hold gold. Remember, Bernanke thought gold was something that Indians accumulate on wedding day as a trinket, but he doesn't give it any monetary or value whatsoever. Here you have Germany clearly ringing the alarm bell. What about this gold held in New York? Some would argue, including James Rickards, who's a respected author and guest on this show, that the U.S. will not allow Germany to take back their gold. As the paper money apocalypse occurs, you have a debasement around the world, and gold is king once again. Your thoughts?
If you look at history, gold has been used not only as a medium of exchange and money, it's also been used as an instrument of national economic policy, and indeed that borders on national security at certain times. It is entirely conceivable that not just the United States, but any country in a crisis severe enough, in a confrontation severe enough, would seek to nationalize gold that it held on a custodial basis. I think that is a potential, if somewhat extreme, risk. Let's keep in mind, why was that gold, or why is that gold, presumably, beneath the Federal Reserve in Manhattan? It's the legacy of Bretton Woods. You know, once upon a time under Bretton Woods, when countries were settling balance of payments, literally, people would walk bars of gold from one country's locker to another country's locker underneath the Federal Reserve. So there was a convenience factor that explained it.
Germany is saying that convenience factor is why they don't want to move it back to Germany.
Which doesn't make sense, because we no longer have a gold-backed monetary system. There is no convenience argument really to be made. And I agree, it sounds a bit odd. It's simply the legacy of Bretton Woods. Numerous other countries have repatriated at least some portion of their Bretton Woods gold, France being the clear sort of champion of doing that. They did it years ago. But most other countries have maybe taken a little bit back. Germany's taken none? Why? It does look a bit odd.
But plus all the gold that they supposedly have on behalf of Germany, it's unmarked. There's no serial numbers. There's no bar numbers. But let's talk about actually as a CIO, Chief Investment Officer. Okay, you are obviously master of the cash flow and the balance sheet and the bond market. This is your area of expertise more than anything else. So talk about the 30-year bull market in Treasury bonds. How many more decades will that be going on?
Well, it's interesting. That 30-year bull market in Treasury bonds actually began during the gold mania of the late 70s, early 80s, when many people, including Alan Greenspan, speculated that the United States would have to restore gold convertibility to stabilize the dollar. Even Alan Greenspan had gone that far by that time. So 30 years on, well, obviously we haven't done a great job at restoring confidence in the dollar, have we? I mean, look at what's going on with the financial system, and therefore, of course, everyone is fleeing into treasuries, which yield only whatever 1.5% these days, below the rate of inflation as officially measured, as other people measure it. It's way below the rate of inflation.
You used the word flee, and or fear. Mm-hmm. And bubbles can be created by fear just as easily as they can be created by greed. So in the case of, let's say, the dot-com bubble, famous dot-com bubble and burst, that was a greed-based bubble. Here with the bond market, from what I hear what you're saying here, is that people are fleeing. They are frightened by the geopolitics of our era. They're frightened by the financial crisis. They're frightened by everything that's going on. They're in fear. They're buying bonds and driving that bond price up to, in America, really it's at a 240-year high. Bond prices have never been higher in American history going back to the Revolutionary War. I mean, that sounds like a bubble.
It does sound like a bubble. That said, if Treasury bonds truly offered a fail-safe form of financial insurance, insurance against banking crises, insurance against sovereign defaults, insurance against you name it, then you could argue that in fact it is really where fear belongs. But do Treasury bonds offer a safe haven against dollar devaluation? No. Do they offer a safe haven against the Fed monetizing ever more debt? No. Do they offer a safe haven against the U.S. at some point throwing its hands up and defaulting on some portion of its bonds, restructuring some portion of its bonds for some political reason? I don't know. The fact is the risks are there. They're not there with something physical and tangible that cannot be printed or diluted at will, such as gold, other precious metals, or for that matter, commodities in general.
All right, John Butler, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I want to thank my guest, John Butler. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.